Everyone to the non-applicable clauses, permissible exclusions, exemptions presentation. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. A couple of notes for everyone before we get started. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please type your questions into the question portion of the dashboard. We have made some time at the end of the presentation for your questions. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two key ways. First of all, if you'd like to get a copy of the slides, those will be made available for you for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, we do post all of our previously recorded webinars on our YouTube page. And that can be accessed, again, by going to PJR's website and looking for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today, we're going to address what the term non-applicable clauses means and where it comes from. We're going to talk about high-level requirements and how they influence this issue. We're going to have some in-depth discussion on outsourcing, and we're going to bring in some historical perspective from ISO 9001-2008 on this concept. We're going to move on to look at outsourcing as it's discussed in ISO 9001-2015, and also have some discussion on the limited scope potential for a quality management system. A couple concluding remarks, and then finally your questions. Now, for our presentation today, we're going to be examining these concepts specifically as they are addressed in ISO 9001-2015. Now, these same concepts of exemptions and non-applicable clauses, these appear in many other standards, AS 9100, IATF 16949. But in those standards, there are typically going to be sector-specific requirements that apply that we won't be covering today. Now, PJR does have webinars on all three of these standards and many others. So I do invite you to check out our website for further information on those other presentations. So let's begin with what are non-applicable clauses? What is that term? Well, it's taken right from ISO 9001 itself, and it can be found in clause 4.3. In section 4.3, it states that an organization's scope needs to specify the types of products and services that are covered, and also provide justification for any requirement of the standard that the organization has determined as not applicable to the scope of the quality management system. Now, 4.3 goes on to state that your scope and the non-applicable clauses, these need to be maintained as documented information. That means they need to be written down somewhere, whether that's within a quality manual, a scope document, or some other format. Now, for our presentation today, I'm going to be referring to non-applicable clauses as exemptions. That's kind of a more inclusive term, and it's a little easier to say as we're going through this presentation. For an exemption to be justified, as we saw, it is something that has to not be part of the quality management system as defined by the scope. So in other words, you can't identify a scope for your system and then say, but just not this part of it. If it's within the scope, it can't be excluded. So let's dig into this a little bit and get a sense of understanding this requirement a bit better. And let's begin with high-level requirements. Now, there's a lot of guidance that we've pulled from for today's presentation. To begin with, from the committee that wrote ISO 9001, the TC 176 committee. I've got some older materials from them to share with you. The ISO 9001 Auditing Practices Group, This is a joint task force representing both the ISO and IAF. They've issued some thoughts on this. I'm going to be outlining some content from the standard itself, both in the auditable and guidance portions. And lastly, I've got a couple of things that I'll be sharing with you from the technical specification 9002, which is guidelines for the application of ISO 9001. This is a document that's made available to organizations that are seeking to implement ISO 9001 and are looking for some guidance. So let's begin with the TC 176 committee position papers. Now, these are a bit dated at this point. These go back to October 2008, shortly after the 9001-2008 standard was published. At that time, the committee issued a couple of officially binding documents. The first was called Guidance on Application. The other was Guidance on Outsourced Processes. Now, these two items taken together introduced a requirement, a statement, that at the time was somewhat controversial. Now, what was so controversial was this idea of outsourcing. And we can pull some excerpts from both of the guidance documents. First of all, they stated that situations where conformity should not be claimed included where an organization excludes a requirement on the basis that the activity has been outsourced. And furthermore, and more strongly, they stated that it's to emphasize that when an organization chooses to outsource, whether permanently or temporarily, a process that affects product conformity with requirements, it can't ignore that process, and it can't exclude it from the quality management system. In other words, an exemption that is rooted in outsourcing is not an acceptable exemption. And at that time, we were instructing our auditors to write nonconformances about that. That was kind of controversial, as you can expect. This was a new idea, the idea that even though it's not done in the building, that it still applies and it still counts towards your system. Obviously, the elephant in the room with this is design. Design, obviously, this is a very emotionally charged topic for a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations are very strongly opposed to having design looked at, especially if it's excluded or outsourced rather. So going back before we had this guidance, we had clients at that time that were excluding design, for example, because designs were coming from a parent company or a sister company. And what we learned was that those exemptions were potentially not appropriate and should not have been automatically accepted. I'll be clarifying those comments in a couple of minutes here. To put it very simply, there are going to be two basic justifications to exempt the design and development requirements. Number one, if an organization is receiving a complete product design from their customers, and I do mean complete, not something that you're going to send back with revisions, complete product design. Or the other situation is if you are not manufacturing products based on a product design. So if you're a warehouse, a distributorship, and so forth. There is a third option we'll be exploring a little bit later in the presentation. Now, obviously, if you're outsourcing design, the obvious question for some organizations is, well, how do you audit something I don't do? And we got this from auditors too. There were a lot of auditors that were opposed to this new approach when we first broke ground on this. But as a reminder, we're not auditing the actual activity. We are auditing the outsourcing and the control of the outsourcing. So with that in mind, let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into outsourcing and kind of explore what that's all about. To begin with, outsourcing is defined in ISO 9000. This is the Fundamentals and Vocabulary document, where it states that outsourcing is to make an arrangement where an external organization performs part of an organization's function or process. And that last bit is key. It's your function, it's your process, it's still your responsibility. You still have ownership of that function or process. And the note that's written below the definition is even more on the nose. It acknowledges that the external organization itself is outside of the scope of your management system, but the outsourced function or process is within the scope. So even though you're using a third party to perform, whether it's calibration or design or whatnot, that activity is still part of your management system, and therefore you can't exclude it. That's the takeaway from this. That's the key idea here. Now, as I've alluded to, there's a lot of things that can potentially be outsourced by an organization. I don't have these in any particular order, but right at the top, I've got calibration and verification of measurement devices. I would opine that probably 80% or more of the companies that Perry Johnson does business with outsource some aspect of either calibration or verification of measurement devices. Training is very common as something that we're going to get from an outside source. Design, as we've mentioned, and plenty of other areas. So there's a lot of potentials in terms of activities that are going to potentially be outsourced. So where is outsourcing discussed in ISO 9001:2015? Well, it is primarily addressed in section 8.4, where it states that externally provided processes, products, and services need to conform to requirements, and it is the organization's responsibility to ensure that. This term, external provider, is given some context in Annex A8, which is also found in ISO 9001, where it states that all forms of externally provided processes, products, and services, same terms from Section 8.4, whether through an arrangement with an associate company or outsourcing processes to an external provider. So it's, again, very on the nose, this idea that it could be a parent company, a sister company, etc., that's providing this externally provided process, product, or service. In the 9002 guidance document, there's the following statement, that external providers could include the organization's corporate headquarters, associate companies, suppliers, or someone to whom the organization has outsourced a process. The auditing practices group, they've stated in their guidance document, scope of ISO 9001, that outsourcing is to be considered an input to the development of the organization's scope. As a reminder, when we're auditing an outsourced activity, we're not auditing the actual activity itself. We're not getting in the car and driving up the road to the parent company or what have you. We are confirming that controls have been established for the interface with that outsourced activity. That's what's really applicable here. That's what we're looking to confirm. So what do we mean by controls? How do you control an activity that doesn't take place in your building? Well, I'm sure for most of you, you've already got your arms around this. How do you ensure that something is done by a supplier to your specifications? You write up a contract. You write up a purchase order. You spell it all out in an email. You have a standard terms and conditions on your company website. Maybe it's so important you actually go and perform an audit at that external provider. or you require them to maintain a certification like ISO 9001, or maybe it's so important that you take the time to write out work instructions for that organization. Lots of possibilities. So let's consider a company, an example, where an organization chooses to outsource 100% of their calibration and verification activity to a calibration laboratory. Well, what is the auditor going to look at? Well, they're going to look at potentially the contract that was issued to that laboratory. They'll look at calibration records issued by the laboratory and gauge labeling that was applied by the laboratory. You'll note that none of that equivocates to a review of the actual calibration or verification activity. In that scenario, none of the applicable clauses from ISO 9001 that pertain to calibration would be claimed as an exemption. Everything from Section 715 would be included and applicable, and that's key to understanding this requirement. Now, one of the things that we've trained our auditors and the members of our executive committee to do is to review the organization's website, both as part of the audit process and as part of the audit approval process. Now, bear in mind, your website is admissible as audit evidence. So if you have a website, it is something that we are permitted to look at in the context of performing the audit. So when we do that, we're looking for a couple of key things. We want to make sure that the website reflects the scope that we've issued to you. In other words, we don't want to certify you for injection molding and go on your website and it says that you do dog grooming or something different. That's going to raise concerns, obviously. And a little deeper than that, we want to verify, does this website discuss design activity? And we happen to have you classified as no design. This happens fairly often, and when it does come up, we have to dig in and investigate it. So when we note design on a website for a client that's been classified as no design, these are some of the explanations we've gotten over the years. Corporate provides the designs. Well, as we've learned, that's not acceptable to be classed as no design if you're getting product designs from a parent company. Sometimes the explanation is we don't really provide design services, but we want to attract potential customers by saying that we do. This is actually not acceptable either. We need to ensure that the website and the design classification are aligned with each other. And in rare cases, we've been told, well, we did design our products, but the products were designed 30 to 40 years ago. Now, that obviously very rare, but it does happen once in a while. And in those circumstances, what we've typically done is left the organization classified as full design, but we've taken steps to have the audit time, the audit duration make sense in the face of the time that has been elapsed since the last product was designed. Now, let's take a few minutes and talk about limited scope as an option. Most of the clients that we have, their intent is for the entire operation to be included in the ISO 9001 certification. In other words, everything in the building. We do from time to time have clients that come to us and say, well, I only want this part of my business to be certified. Now, if that is the case, it then opens the door for the possibility of some exemptions that would not have been possible in a full scope situation. So here's an example of how this might work. Let's say that we have an organization manufacturing clothing for industrial and commercial markets. So we'll say that they're doing leather goods for industrial applications and polyester goods for commercial applications. Now in ISO 9001, there's a section that talks about warranty provisions in section 855. So let's assume that this organization offers warranty returns on the commercial products, but not on the industrial products. Now, if that company wanted to pursue ISO certification for the industrial product line only, it is possible that they'd be able to claim a full or partial exemption from clause 855. So again, sometimes with a limited scope, it is possible to exclude areas. But understand that if what's in the scope is subject to warranty or design or what have you, you can't exclude it just because you don't want it looked at during the audit. So what happens if you are taking an inappropriate exemption? Well, the most appropriate result of this is a nonconformance. And we've looked earlier at what the possible clause numbers are going to be. Now, if you are written up in the context of an audit and you don't agree with it, or whatever the nonconformance is for, we do have a dispute process. And it is discussed in PGR Procedure Pro 10. If you need a copy of Pro 10, you can find that anytime on our website. Just go to the home page and look for the link entitled Registration Document Download. So back in 2017, we rolled out a new certification option for clients that are in this unique situation where some or all of their product designs are coming from a parent or affiliate company. And we classified it full design outsourced. Now, if you happen to be classified as full design outsourced, here's what that means in terms of steps that are taken. A full design outsourced organization is going to have audit time potentially calculated in the same manner that we currently use for a no design client. Now, there are some considerations that need to be made with that, and I'll be clarifying that in a couple of slides here. An organization that is classified as full design outsourced does not claim any part of design as an exemption because, again, it all applies via outsourcing. And the certificate that's issued has to indicate design as part of the scope statement. Now, when we rolled out this full design outsourced classification, we actually reached out to the ANAB to make sure that they were okay with what we were doing. Now, this was kind of a revolutionary step, what we were doing. They indicated that they felt our new process was appropriate, but they emphasized that the controls had to be applied to the outsourced processes and that those controls had to be included in the audit process. So I've got some excerpts here from the communications that we received from ANAB at that time. They stated that the complexity, activities, and risks that are present due to an outsourced provider of processes, products, or services need to be controlled or confirmed during the audit. And furthermore, that Section 8.4 of ISO 9001 has many requirements that apply to the organization when certifying an organization that has outsourced activities. And these have to be confirmed and evaluated by the certification body. ANAB also emphasized that automatic time reductions for product design status are not automatic. These are not appropriate if you're doing things automatically. They stated that in all cases, the certification body is required to clearly, effectively, and realistically justify and document justifications for any adjustment, whether an increase or a decrease in audit time from established audit day tables. So in other words, we can't be expected to initially reduce audit time because we've classified you as full design outsourced, unless we've had an on-site auditor give us assurance that the controls that you're applying to your outsourced processes are mature, effective, and can be assessed with no added audit time. So that's why we may not go from full design outsourced to having time parity with no design, but we can get there, and usually we can get there fairly quickly. So we now have 4 options for classification for design. So let's go over what those options are and explain the differences between them. Obviously, we have full design. This means that you are responsible for the design of at least one of the products that you manufacture. Now, in this case, obviously, all portions of clause 8.3 are going to be applicable and cannot be excluded. For no design, this is an organization that receives all designs from customers or otherwise does not interact with product designs. If you are correctly classed as no design, you can exclude everything from section 8.3. Special note on this, if you are receiving product designs from parent or affiliate companies, but you don't have the responsibility for product design, and you're not advertising or representing that you're responsible for product design activity, it's possible that you may qualify for classification as no design. That is something that we would verify in the context of the audit process itself. We also have a classification option called partial design. Now, this is going to be an organization that provides technical input, review, verification, or other design services to their clients, but they don't have responsibility for final design approval. Now, we actually have very few clients that are classified in this manner. If you are partial design, you will be able to exclude portions, but not all of clause 8.3. And then finally, we have our full design outsourced classification, where you are receiving all or some of your product designs from parent and affiliate companies, and you are advertising or otherwise representing that you are responsible for product design activity. And obviously, you cannot exclude anything from section 8.3 if you are correctly classed as full design outsourced. So in conclusion, we want to ensure that our audit process is value added for our clients while addressing all applicable requirements. Making sure that the exemptions are justified is an important part of this process. I do want to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have ISO 9001, Introduction to the World's Most Popular Standard. This is a structured introduction to ISO 9001 and tries to provide some insight on key concepts. We have a presentation on statutory and regulatory requirements, and we have presentations on many other items, process mapping, stage 1 auditing, various other standards, and so forth. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to opt in by providing your email address on the homepage of pgr.com. Just go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address, and click subscribe. You will be opted in for automatic updates on changes to the standards, upcoming webinars, and other points of information. I do thank you for your time and attention. I'm going to go ahead and unlock the questions from the dashboard here. Let's see what we've got. Janice Guy asks, based on 841, if a company outsources IT, cannot be exempted. That is correct, Janice. You would not exempt that requirement. Any other questions today? Okay, hope everyone has a great day. Oh, we have another question here. John Lamping, how do you factor equipment upgrades into a system? Well, John, I'm not entirely sure I understand your question. If you're talking about an outsourced company upgrading your manufacturing equipment, I mean, you're still responsible for the infrastructure, you're still responsible for the environment in which your quality management system is carried out. Oh, thank you for the clarification. Factory service on robots. Yes, John, in that instance, you would still be fully responsible for the infrastructure. And in this case, some part of it is being outsourced, but 100% that is still your responsibility, and you would not be excluding any parts of it. Any other questions today? Okay, thank you all. Have a great day.